All right, welcome to the Mastering Blood Sugar podcast. It's Dr. Brian Mowll, and I am joined today by someone that I've followed quite a bit, and you should too, on YouTube and social media. Someone who does a great job of analyzing research and evidence. That is physician and research scientist, Dr. Gil Carvalho. So, Doc, welcome. Glad to be with you here today.
Thanks, Brian. My pleasure.
All right. So I was just talking to you a few minutes ago, and I said I'd love to have sort of a focus of this interview be what does the evidence say, and kind of go through a variety of topics which I think are kind of controversial, at least misunderstood. There's a lot of misinformation out, in the internet world about many of these things. Related to diabetes, type 2 diabetes, specifically in metabolic health, insulin resistance, obesity, and so forth, cardiovascular risk. So first, though, let me just ask you, I know, you've got quite an extensive background in medicine and research. What led you to want to start your own YouTube channel and start sharing information to more of a popular audience as opposed to more of a scientific one?
Yeah, I was doing research full time at the time, 5 years or so ago, and I was looking for a way to bridge the gap between all the scientific knowledge out there and people who have a keen interest in a lot of scientific topics, but aren't necessarily exposed to science directly. Most people's exposure is either through media articles and media headlines, which if you're familiar with my content, a lot of times that can be frustrating and can be a little bastardized in the media articles. And it's not necessarily that they're trying to deceive people, but it's written by journalists, so it's understandable. So there's a lot of oversimplification, a lot of kind of changes of things, and they're looking for the clickable headline, right? And that's the main driver of a lot of these articles. So a lot of times that's not really helpful for the public. And so, yeah, I thought about a number of topics, and nutrition seemed like a good marriage between things that I had done a little bit of research on and was interested in, and also this gap between the interest of the public, the quality of the content that was public facing out there. I felt was not really very high. It's gotten a lot better. Fortunately, there's a lot more scientists on social media contributing to this space. So it just seemed like an interesting thing to start, and started out making videos on nutrition, just introductory in the beginning, just kind of feeling it out, learning how to do it little by little, and it's eventually started to pick up some steam.
Excellent. Yeah, I think it's really needed. There are a lot of, well, not just media, but doctors and influencers and nutritionists and so forth online who share information. And I agree. I don't think there's any ill intent behind it, but I just think that it's so easy to not read deep enough in whatever the scientific study is or the research article, and get confused or just share a little bit of the information without giving the full context. And so you do such a great job of kind of giving that full context and really helping people to understand. So we're going to get into a lot of that, and I think it'll become apparent as we go through some of this information what we mean by that.
No pressure.
Now, yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. And like I said to you before we started recording, I'm going to kind of put you on the spot. And if there's something, I don't expect you to be spouting out references, but if there's something that you're just not sure about, feel free to say it, because
I might not remember. I have no idea what we're going to talk about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's how these podcasts always go.
So for people watching, we didn't rehearse this. I didn't even send over a list of questions. So I'd like to start, my focus and the focus of this podcast is really blood sugar, but more specifically type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance metabolic syndrome and that whole spectrum of conditions. So what have you found is has the clearest evidence for what is driving this epidemic? What's really causing all the type 2 diabetes, obesity, and so forth that we're seeing, not only in the US, but really across the globe in many places today?
So the most reliable indicator of type 2 diabetes remission, so if we start there, is weight loss, right? So across a number of studies over years now, when you see substantial weight loss, and we can talk about kind of ballpark, what type of weight loss we're talking about. In general, you see improvement of glucose metabolism metrics. All the way from insulin resistance to prediabetes to diabetes, you tend to see an improvement. It's very consistent. Not only is it consistent across different interventions, as long as there's weight loss, it also seems to be dose dependent. So one of the most common, one of the most well-known and kind of a landmark trial, the direct trial from Roy Taylor, showed this very nicely. They have a beautiful picture, an image showing this dose-dependent effect where their participants, the more weight they lost, the higher the likelihood that they put diabetes in remission. And so the highest rung was like 80% after, I think it was 10 kilos. I might be wrong on the numbers there, but basically the higher you went, the higher the likelihood. It started out at like 10% or so, and then it went higher, 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 higher. And the people who lost the most weight had an 80% chance of putting their diabetes in remission, which is stunning. So yeah, we have, that's the strongest evidence. Now, when you talk to some people, we've interviewed Roy Taylor, for example, on the channel. He is of the opinion that it's that simple. Like that is the only thing that controls diabetes is when we say weight, I should clarify, we mean fat mass, and we mean fat mass in specific places, right? So it's not, you chop off an arm and a leg, it's not going to work. You lose a lot of muscle, it's not going to work. But it's fat mass, it's excessive fat mass, and specifically it's fat mass accumulated, what we call visceral fat, so around and inside the viscera, the organs, muscle and liver and pancreas and things like that.
Right. For example, liposuction doesn't seem to have that same benefit.
Right. If you just, well, yeah, if you take out the fat, but you don't do anything about the fat that's inside the organs, that's not necessarily gonna help you. And so, yeah, the timeline of this is incredible. Like Roy Taylor was able to see in 7 days, they were able to normalize fasting glucose glycemia in these people who had diabetes in some cases for years. And so that seems to be because the fat in the liver is depleted first, faster. It seems to be like a storage, a depot that the body goes to with more urgency, if you will. And so, yeah, it's kind of encouraging that a disease that is still seen by so many people as something that's a scourge, and it is incredibly debilitating. And a lot of doctors still don't know. When I was in medical school, we didn't learn that this was a reversible thing. It's not a disease that you have it and you're done, but that's essentially how we looked at it. And this work has really been paradigm shifting, and that this is relatively recent. I mean, we had a lot of information pointing to this, but direct is from 2018, 2017, around there, like 2010s. So it's crazy that that it's taken this long to have this sort of insight. Yeah, we can talk more about details. Roy Taylor, as I was kind of talking about, Roy Taylor thinks this is the only factor. I think there are probably some other factors that are more secondary, but yeah, so far they seem to be eclipsed by weight loss.
What about muscle mass? How much of a role do you think that plays?
So it's really interesting. There's some research on this, and so for example, if you look at the best types of exercise to combat type 2 diabetes, it seems to differ depending on body composition. So people who are obese, for example, very large, they tend to have a lot of fat mass, but they also tend to have a substantial amount of muscle underneath the fat. For those individuals, cardio seems to be very important. maybe a bit more than lifting weights. But there are some trials looking at people who are what we sometimes call skinny fat. So people who have a little bit of fat mass, but they are skinny. If you look at them, you don't call them fat. You don't, they look skinny, but then they have too much fat for their body composition, and so their muscle mass is also lower. And in those individuals, uh, lifting weights can have a more beneficial impact on hemoglobin A1C than actual cardio. And so the current model, this model, this hasn't been completely nailed, but the model to explain this discrepancy between trials is that it's precisely what you were hinting at, the muscle mass, because muscle is an important uh, storage unit for glucose, very important to remove glucose from the blood. That if you have enough of a muscle mass, like in obese people often do, the priority there is to lose some of the fat mass. When we lose weight, yes, we lose fat mass, but almost always we're going to lose some lean mass as well. The goal there is to minimize that, right? So that the ratio is the highest fat mass to the lowest muscle mass lost. But so in obese people, that ratio is going to be favorable. When you do cardio, you're going to lose a lot of fat mass, even if you lose some muscle mass, because you have a substantial amount already. The net effect is going to be beneficial. In the skinny fat individuals, I'm putting this in quotes, but that's kind of what we're talking about here. In the skinny fat individuals, they see kind of the opposite. The lifting weights seems better because if you just do cardio, you tend to lose muscle mass, and their muscle mass is already low or too low, so you don't want to go there. But the cardio, but the muscle, getting a little bit of that muscle mass accumulated or grown seems to be beneficial. Of course, the combo is the obvious, the no brainer
All
here
right.
is do both, right? But we have such difficulty in public health getting people to do any exercise at all.
Mhm.
It's easy to say, oh yeah, just do both, but we know that most people are not going to do it, and especially when you're talking to an audience or to a population that has these problems of insulin resistance and excessive adiposity and type 2 diabetes. People have a history that leads to that in most cases. So it's very important to find tools so that they can implement these things and actually keep them going. That's another problem, is the sustainability. It's easy to start, but to keep it going for decades or for many years is a huge hurdle. Um, yeah, so that was a long answer to your muscle question. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, no, no, it's good, and I love that you brought up Dr. Roy Taylor so early in the conversation. I've interviewed him as well here for this podcast, and one of the things that I was fascinated with is he made a substantial point of saying that the starting BMI didn't matter all that much. It was really the percentage of fat that they lost. So it kind
Right.
of echoes what you're saying about uh, the skinny fat, quote unquote, population there, where they could go even from a normal BMI if they had diabetes, probably a little bit of a pooch or some visceral fat there or fat in the liver, and they verified that through MRI studies that you could go from a BMI, for example, of 23, or I think it was 22 and a half or something, with some liver fat, and get down to maybe 19 and a half or 20. And that percentage of fat loss could still have that same effect of putting the diabetes in remission. Pretty fascinating.
Yeah. So Roy Taylor has this great model that I'm sure he talked about if you came on, the personal fat threshold. So it's basically a fancy way of saying that everybody's different, and everybody's got a different threshold of tolerance to excess fat in our bodies. And so some people, because we have to explain when we talk about the problem is excess fat in the body, but then we have to explain how come some people are morbidly obese and don't have type 2 diabetes or even prediabetes, right? And then some people uh, don't have any, are not that large, and they have diabetes. So this is a conundrum. So his model is the personal fat threshold, which tries to explain this threshold, this individual variability that people just have different tolerances to the amount of fat that they accumulate. And so then there's another interesting question, which I talked to him a bit about, which is, are these people just accumulating more fat in the viscera, the ones that are more susceptible, or are they accumulating the same amount of fat, but it's just more damaging in these individuals for some genetic reason, right? Uh, and and so it seems to there seem to be some arguments and some evidence for both. So they do see with his fancy imaging techniques, they do see that some of these people do accumulate more fat in the pancreas, for example, than those who are more resistant to, more tolerant to accumulating fat. But there is some evidence also suggesting maybe a more a higher degree of susceptibility to the fat toxicity itself. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff. But then in the end, he has this kind of practical bottom line, which is just come down a bit wherever it is you are. If you have these conditions, it's likely that it's too high for you, even if it's not too high for your neighbor. So just try to come down a bit until you cross into remission zone.
Right. So just continuing on this topic, but sort of shifting focus a little bit, Dr. Taylor, in his research studies, typically uses, an energy restricted diet. It's, what would be considered a very low calorie diet, typically under 1,000 calories per day, in at least in his original studies. And what have you seen in the evidence regarding different dietary strategies toward achieving this goal of type 2 diabetes remission, or at least, blood sugar control, significant improvements in metabolic health?
There's a lot of heterogeneity, so a lot of diets seem to work. But the biggest hurdle seems to be keeping the values in the healthy range. So not the hardest thing is not getting it done; it's keeping it done for most people. So there's lots of trials with high carb diets, low carb diets, low fat, high fat, Mediterranean, the caloric reduction, fasting. A really interesting study just came out last week. We just shot a video on it, looking at 5-2, this modality of fasting. They had good results, also putting people in remission. It was about 1 out of 5 people in that trial went into remission from type 2 diabetes just doing 5-2. And so it's interesting because with the number of calories that they were eating on those days that they restrict was very similar to Roy Taylor. So Taylor had about 800 calories, give or take, a day. But these guys doing 5-2, so 5 days out of the week, it's a normal diet. And then 2 days out of the week, you're restricting, right? And on those 2 days, they were eating about 790 calories. So roughly what Taylor was doing, but here, just 2 days a week. Now, yeah, if we just compare head to head, which we can't really do, I mean, different trials, it's hard to do that. The numbers in remission will seem lower, but the interesting thing is even just doing a caloric or a dietary change 2 days a week, some people are able to get the result. So it's another indication of this, the flexibility that there is. Right? I mean, I think this is great news because it gives us a lot of options, like the repertoire of options is enormous. Because it would, I mean, if it was the case that only diet XYZ worked, I mean, okay, if that's what the evidence says, great, but it would be bad news for a lot of humans because whoever doesn't adapt to that is then, is out of luck. But it turns out that a lot of these diets can work, and we have trials for a lot of them. So, yeah, the key there seems to be sustainability. Can the individual in question sustain the diet in the long run? Is it something that they, and all different factors will come into this, from personal preference to the family, what the family eats. We know that those social factors are huge. So yeah, whatever the person can tolerate, all these can work. Low carb diets can work. High carb diets have some trials indicating that they can work. Mediterranean diets have a few trials as well. There's some trials out of China that are looking at a diet that is reminiscent of a Mediterranean style diet as well. So it's a diet with like fruits and vegetables and some whole grains and things like that, and lean meats, kind of a Mediterranean style pattern. Yeah, all of that seems to work, but the key is the long term sustainability.
Okay, so as people are listening to this and sort of making decisions or getting ideas about maybe some of the things that they can try for themselves, you said that sustainability is a big factor. So it's got to be something that you maybe enjoy doing or feel like you can be successful with. In other words, if you hate the taste of meat, some sort of high animal based type diet probably isn't for you. If you have horrible SIBO and get terrible reactions to legumes and super fibrous foods, then I mean that probably needs to be addressed. But maybe that's not the best place to start. So there's a variety of factors there. What else do people need to be thinking about? And this will probably lead us into a topic about saturated fat and cardiovascular risk and some other factors. But as we're weighing out kind of the diet that we want to adapt for ourselves for good metabolic health, what should we be thinking about?
I think what you're alluding to is the fact that many diets can improve diabetes metrics, but there are other factors also, especially long term, that will have a huge impact on our health. There are some interesting examples. I mean, there's all kinds of anecdotal and like case study type evidence that really makes this case that almost any diet can work as long as you can cut the calories. It's kind of stunning. Like they're all the way from Walter Kempner's rice diet, so a diet of white rice and sugar and fruit juice that improved diabetes metrics in most of his patients, all the way to Twinkie diet, all these like almost like cartoonish examples, right? That you can see these improvements in diabetes metrics and glucose metabolism metrics, even with diets that nobody would imagine could do it, as long as you really keep the calories under control. So I think the take home message here is that is very important, obviously, to improve those diabetes metrics and glucose metrics, but let's not forget it's a puzzle with multiple pieces, and not be exclusively focused on glucose, just like I wouldn't recommend anyone be exclusively focused on blood pressure or exclusively focused on ApoB or exclusively focused on anything. Like our health is a composite. So yes, I think this diversity of diets, but there are common themes to a healthy dietary pattern that have emerged over decades of research that suggest that in general, diets, for example, you want to go easy on ultra processed foods. You don't want to have a lot of that. Even if you're able to control calories somehow, that's impressive because most people can't. But even then, it wouldn't be recommended as a long term approach. Yeah, the whole fat thing that you were alluding to there, saturated, unsaturated. The main concern is cardiovascular because as a whole, populationally, more unsaturated forms of fat are easier on the cardiovascular system. They don't lower ApoB. They actually help lower. They don't raise it. They help lower it. And the cardiovascular risk data is out there as well. And then in the context of diabetes specifically, there is some evidence that unsaturated fats may be a little easier on the liver in terms of liver insulin resistance. They may be a little more beneficial. But again, I want to emphasize that calories will trump this for diabetes specifically. So yeah, you can eat a diet that is extremely high in saturated fat and improve your diabetes metrics. There's no question about that because calories and weight loss are such a big player. But yeah, in terms of long term, yeah, I would use something that I think is useful is thinking about the traditional Mediterranean diet as a reference, as a starting point, and then tweaking from there. So that has all the right buttons pushed. But then, for example, you want to eat lower fat than a typical Mediterranean diet, no problem. You go easier on the fats. Maybe you remove the olive oil and you go a little higher on the healthy carbohydrates that are in the Mediterranean diet. Maybe you like a lower carbohydrate diet, no problem. You go a little easier on the starchy vegetables and maybe the legumes, and you go a little higher on the fats, like the fatty fish and the seafood and the olive oil and the nuts and seeds, right? So you tweak that to fit your personal preference. I think that's maybe a good reference point.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk a little bit more about the saturated fats and, polyunsaturated fats and so forth, because I think this gets a lot of airplay online and on YouTube and so forth. There's controversy around seed oils, industrially processed seed oils, and is saturated fat, the devil? Is it something that, I'm sure there's a threshold where a little is okay, a lot maybe is a problem. So, what have you been able to parse out of the evidence as far as the role of saturated fat in not only cardiovascular risk and LDL and the lipids, but also with diabetes, because there are a lot of people saying that saturated fat independently can contribute to diabetes risk.
Yeah, we touched a little bit on that. There is some evidence that saturated fat leads to more triglyceride accumulation intrahepatically and is a bit more conducive to liver insulin resistance than unsaturated fats. There is some trial evidence looking at isocaloric comparisons. So I think that data is out there. Again, like I said, the calories will trump that. So bear that in mind when people say, "Oh, this is all hogwash because I went on this very high saturated fat diet and I put my diabetes in remission, so the science is wrong." There's no contradiction there, right? The two things can be true at the same time. In terms of the cardiovascular disease, uh, the fact that a diet that's very high in saturated fat tends to raise cardiovascular risk populationally, I think is very compelling from the consistency of the evidence from observational to interventional. Now, there is plenty of nuance, and I think that's where a lot of the controversy comes in. One of the sources of controversy is replacement. So it's what we're comparing saturated fat to. So when we compare saturated fat to refined carbohydrate, we don't see much of a difference in terms of coronary heart disease risk. And so a lot of times these cohort studies that are brought up as, oh, here we see these populations, there's a difference in their saturated fat intake, but their heart disease risk doesn't change. So the science is wrong. Well, what is it being compared to? So if the saturated fat level comes down, but it's replaced with a refined carbohydrate, we know that that's not going to make much of a difference isocalorically, right? Not if there's a difference in calories, that's another question. But so that explains some of the controversy. It's a common question, the issue of replacement. Source of saturated fat, I think, matters. So, for example, people talk about dairy, but it's such a huge mixed bag. And the data for fermented sources of dairy looks better. So, yogurt, for example, and even cheese looks better in terms of cardiovascular outcomes than straight butter, for example. And there are some theories for why that might be in terms of saturated fat absorption in the intestine, calcium binding to saturated fat and inhibiting absorption, all these ideas. But in general, that's the trend. There is individual variation as well. As always, some people can handle more than others. I think one thing that makes a lot of sense, I had Ethan Weiss on a while back, and we went over this. And his approach as a cardiologist is go by your blood work, because if your ApoB is great, just talking about cardiovascular disease, right? If your ApoB is great and you eat a bit more meat than the next guy, I'm less worried about you. And if the next guy is eating cleaner, but his ApoB is a nightmare, there's more concern there. And it might be something genetic, or it might be something that can be tweaked with diet. So it becomes case by case. And I think the more I think about this, the more I talk about this, the more I think that talking about saturated fat and talking about these nutrients, I don't know how much this helps the public, honestly.
Okay.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, thinking about foods and dietary patterns is more helpful because nobody measures. I don't measure my saturated fat intake.
Right.
Very few people do. If I ask you what percentage of your calories comes from saturated fat, very few people are going to know that.
Right.
Um, but you do know what foods you eat, and then you can
Hmm.
kind of back uh, calculate or back reason based on that. So I think, as we were talking about, kind of this traditional Mediterranean diet, as it's described, not the Mediterranean diet that's practiced nowadays. It doesn't mean that I live in Italy and my cousin eats pizzas and from like some fast food joint all the time. So I'm on a Mediterranean diet because I put olive oil on my junk food. No, but
Right.
the traditional Mediterranean diet. Yeah, I
Okay.
think that helps people more than the nutrition, the nutrient, the individual nutrient focus.
All right. So you mentioned the conversation with Ethan Weiss and how blood work can be a good way to kind of determine whether or not if you let's say you are eating a high saturated fat diet just based on the foods you're eating a lot of, fatty cuts of beef and tons of eggs and butter and all that. Um, and you are seeing an elevation in ApoB and LDL and so forth. Let's lean into that a bit because again, another point of controversy. Actually, someone sent me a video link just today. You'll probably get it also. It was someone talking about life insurance companies and actuarial data and how they don't care that much about LDL. It's all about total cholesterol HDL ratio and how you can have a really high LDL and still get a premium, life insurance policy and how, these people aren't dumb, so we shouldn't care about LDL either. So, that's maybe a good example of some of what we were talking about at the beginning of the interview. So what does we'll go back to this focus. What does the evidence say about lipid health, LDL specifically, whether we're talking about LDL-C or LDL particle number and ApoB and so forth? How do you break all that down?
So LDL cholesterol is useful, but it's an imperfect metric of cardiovascular risk. It's kind of a reflection. This is the way I think about it. It's like you're trying to identify a person, for example, and by looking at their shadow, right, on a wall. Depending on the quality of the light, you might be able to tell a lot about that person. But if the light changes, the height's going to change dramatically. If the angle at which, right, it's going to be a bit of an educated guess, but kind of a wild guess. LDL cholesterol is a little bit like that. In general, it's a decent red flag, especially on the extremes, right? If it's extremely high, it's more likely that it's pointing to something. If you measure a more reliable metric like ApoB or like LDL particle number, or a more accessible metric that everybody has, if you have a basic lipid panel, is your non-HDL cholesterol, which is very close to ApoB. So just take your basic lipid panel, just take your total cholesterol, subtract your HDL cholesterol from that, and you get your non-HDL cholesterol. Not to be confused with these ratios. The ratios are tricky too. But so these metrics, the non-HDL cholesterol, the ApoB, are better indicators of cardiovascular risk. And we can talk about why in this concept of discordance. In It's very common for LDL cholesterol to mismatch with ApoB. ApoB, I don't know if your audience is familiar with what these things kind of measure, but very briefly, ApoB measures the number of particles that carry lipids. LDL cholesterol is one of the lipids being carried by the LDL particles. So yeah, LDL cholesterol is kind of a dirty indicator that I wouldn't ignore if it's high, but I would study it more. I would look into, do I actually have something to worry about? In some cases, it might be a false alarm. In others, it's not. And it's by looking at these other metrics, non-HDL cholesterol, ApoB, that we can differentiate.
Yeah, I mean, dyslipidemia is certainly can cause problems. I see it mainly, or I see it largely as a red flag of some sort of metabolic imbalance. You know, typically we'll see that insulin resistance in the liver when we see whether it's high triglycerides or high LDL particle number or even high LDL-C. That typically is pointing towards something else going on. Maybe with the exception of certain genetic conditions, obviously.
Right. So there is something very interesting, since your audience, and this is a diabetes focused show, there is something that's very characteristic of populations that are insulin resistant and type 2 diabetic, where LDL cholesterol might not change much compared to a person who doesn't have these conditions. The change that we see is not LDL cholesterol. It might be similar, but ApoB is higher. So in these populations with type 2 diabetes, this discordance that we were talking about is very prevalent. In some populations, up to 70% of people are discordant. So that's a very remarkable statistic there, that most people, in some populations at least, in some studies, most people with type 2 diabetes, their LDL cholesterol is not a reliable metric of their cardiovascular risk. And that this has to do with particle size and how these things change with metabolic impairments. Because as I'm sure you've heard, people with obesity, people with insulin resistance, people with type 2 diabetes tend to have smaller LDL particles, which means their number can be elevated without the content necessarily being elevated. So that's something that's important to bear in mind. You may have an LDL cholesterol that looks perfectly normal within the standards of the medical, these conventions, but your ApoB might be a lot higher than your LDL cholesterol suggests.
Yeah, I had just to reinforce that real quick. I had just today was reviewing a patient's labs, and a new patient, and their LDL cholesterol was 90. We ran particle number and the NMR profile on them. They had a LDL particle number of between 18 and 1900, and their ApoB I think was like around 115 or so. So there's a perfect example of that. You know, they would, with a basic lipid panel, they probably would not have been flagged. So, or definitely would not have been flagged. So it's interesting when you see that discordance.
Yeah. It also goes in the other direction. So that's not common with people with diabetes, but some people, LDL cholesterol will run a little high. It might be 105 or 110. And then you look at ApoB and it's better than your LDL cholesterol would suggest. So they have larger particles, right? So sometimes it's good news. Depends on the individual.
Interesting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about glycemic excursions, because this is something that gets a lot of clicks on social media, looking at how people's blood sugar reacts to this food and that food and so forth. And there's this idea that if your blood sugar goes up at all after a meal, that it's extremely dangerous. It has, devastating consequences and so forth. So what does the evidence show regarding sort of the response to particular foods, when you look at the glucose? In other words, is there something showing that these big spikes are problematic? Is it the length of time that the blood sugar's up? What have you seen in regards to that?
So I think one thing that helps to to put this issue of the glucose excursions in context is realizing that these changes in glucose level happen with all kinds of physiological activities. So they happen with exercise, after exercise, especially intense exercise. It's normal for glucose to go up. During phases of sleep, glucose will go up and down. So glucose excursions in and of themselves are completely physiological. Now, if your glucose level stays high for hours, that's not normal. What's normal is this nice wave of going up and down because your body has the ability to bring it to react and to bring it down. When your insulin response is blunted, or even earlier in the process, when your organs aren't responding normally to insulin, your liver isn't responding normally, for example, then you have high glucose, even or depending on the stage of the process, right? If we're talking insulin resistance, you might not have hyperglycemia yet. By the time you get to prediabetes, diabetes, your glucose levels are high. But that is basically, this is a point at which your body has lost the ability to process glucose normally. So that's point number one, isn't it? The glucose going up and down after a meal is perfectly normal. Staying up is not normal. That's why the criteria to diagnose diabetes, by the way, is 2 hours after eating. It's not 10 minutes after eating. So these levels that people talk about, whether it's 140 or 200 or whatever the cutoff for prediabetes, diabetes, it's 2 hours after eating, right? Precisely because in a normal individual, healthy individual, there will be an elevation and a return to baseline. Now, there is some uncertainty in terms of the height. I think that's fair to say. It's possible. I wouldn't rule out that super physiological peaks might create a problem in some people. For example, I know that there's some people who say that they have reactions to foods, and sometimes it's not even. We're not talking like candy. Like I know people who say, people with medical training and say, oh, oatmeal. I would get really sleepy after eating oatmeal, and then I wore a CGM, and I realized I was having this massive peak and then this hypoglycemic episode after. Is it theoretically possible that there's something there, that this person has a different physiology, and it might be better for them, at least at a personal level, at a subjective level, to eat a smaller amount or to eat some other food instead? I think that's possible. I wouldn't rule that out. But yeah, I think just the caution to not be glib with the CGM data and with all these things, and not, oh, my glucose went up. I'm developing diabetes because my glucose level went up after eating. Not the same as having high glucose in the fasting state. It's similar to heart rate or blood pressure, right? Heart rate goes up during exercise, perfectly normal. Blood pressure goes up during exercise, perfectly normal. But if my blood pressure is high when I've been sitting for 20 minutes, that's a problem. Same idea.
Yeah, it's like a blessing and a curse that we can measure glucose so easily, I guess. If we could wear continuous triglyceride monitors or continuous thyroid hormone monitors, we might see a lot of these fluctuations in some of these as well. So,
I'm not.
all right, great.
CGMs. Let me just the disclaimer.
Sure.
I am not anti-CGMs. I think
Right.
CGM is very useful. I'm not even against people who have no diabetes or people who are healthy who want to wear a CGM for fun. And I'm not opposed to that. It's just like with any tool, right? We can use a tool incorrectly. So just learning what the information means, that's all.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it can be very motivating for people with diabetes or blood sugar imbalances to see, oh,
Yeah.
wow, I didn't realize I was having such a major, no wonder why, my hemoglobin A1C is so high. So yeah, can be a very useful tool. It just needs to be used correctly. Well, this has been amazing. I'm not going to hold you up here all night, so I want to let people know that if they want more of this, if they want to find out more of what the evidence really shows for these topics and many, many more, you have a great YouTube channel, Nutrition Made Simple, I believe is the name of it. How do people find you there? Is that it?
Yeah, Nutrition Made Simple on YouTube and on Twitter. If you Google Nutrition Made Simple, you should be able to find me, or search it on YouTube. And then I have a few other platforms. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. There's a Facebook page, and we're starting to play with Instagram and TikTok this year.
Okay. No dancing videos, though, I hope.
I'm open to suggestions.
Whatever I'm told to do. Sounds good.
Requests, yeah.
So just one final question here for you, Gil, and I appreciate your time tonight. What's been the biggest surprise that you've seen in the research or the evidence related to metabolic health? Or maybe not the biggest, but just one that you can think of. You know, is there anything that you've come across that sort of wasn't obvious to you before you read that research?
Nothing of what we talked to tonight was obvious to me before I read the research. So
Okay.
everything I've learned was interesting and some novel by definition. I mean, sometimes some things are more intuitive, right? But all of this stuff, the role of the muscle that we talked about, this variety of diets, that all working, the fact that it's muscle mass, that it's not really a specific nutrient, because we still see that this might be okay. This one might be maybe not the biggest surprise, but maybe the biggest contrast between messages that people are exposed to on social media and what the scientific evidence, the balance of scientific evidence is telling us, is this contrast between the focus on one specific nutrient causes diabetes versus it's an excess of calories, right? On social media, it still is like that, although it has slowly changed. But when I started out, almost everything out there was, it's this nutrient that you're eating, or it's this food that you're eating. Just stop eating that one food. And it was funny because you would go to a vegan guru and it was animal products that cause diabetes. You would go to a low fat guru and it was fat in the diet. You go to a low carb guru, it was carb in the diet. And then you look at the evidence, it's like, it's not really, man. Like, there are nuggets of truth as usual, right? All of these diets can fix it, can put you in remission, all of that. But when you look at the full puzzle, like, none of these answers are satisfactory. So that may be, I think, the biggest kind of epiphany of, okay, here's the evidence, and here's how looking at one piece of the puzzle and leaving everything else aside can give you a really warped view of the world. And only by putting everything together, you go, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, not as exciting of a message as,
Right.
Some of the more polarizing ideas out there. But hey, you've shown that you can build a big following and get a lot of, get a lot of eyeballs on real science and information that does, I would say go more down the, down the midline of these ideas. So yeah, exactly. So anyway, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. Everybody check out Nutrition Made Simple, all the social media pages and YouTube. And Dr. Gil Carvalho, thanks so much.
My pleasure.